This really happened to me. And even now, when I tell it, people don't believe how far the betrayal went. The smell of lemon polish still clings to my memory of that night-hour dining table gleaming under the chandelier, when my own daughter, the one I raised with both hands, and every sacrifice, slid an envelope across the table and whispered that she'd already put me up for sale. Not my house, not my belongings, me. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far a story flows. The years before that moment were nothing like what you'd expect from a man whose daughter would one day treat him as an obstacle instead of blood. I grew up in Chicago, worked steel for decades, saved every dollar, until my hands blistered and my back refused to straighten. That house in Oak Park with the maple tree out front wasn't just wood, and brick was proof that the sacrifices my wife and I made were worth it. We raised Melissa there, the kind of girl who used to sleep with her softball glove beside her pillow, who once cried when I refused to let her feed every stray cat on the block. But people change when money whispers in their ear. And Melissa, somewhere between college loans and her second marriage, began looking at me, not as her father, but as a gatekeeper standing between her and a fortune she thought she deserved. I noticed the first cracks when she brought home a man named Victor, a slick-dressed mortgage broker with too much cologne and a handshake that lingered like a dare. He called me sir, but never looked me in the eye, always scanning the living room like he was appraising it. And Melissa clung to him, laughing at his half-done jokes, her eyes darting to me as if daring me to say something. I told myself it was nothing, just the awkward tension of new family dynamics. But when I caught Victor standing in my garage staring at the deeds and folders I kept in a fireproof safe, I felt something inside me twist. He gave some excuse about looking for a screwdriver. I didn't believe him. At 62, I thought my biggest worries would be arthritis, or whether the Cubs could win another World Series in my lifetime. Instead, I was about to discover that my own child had orchestrated a betrayal so cruel it would force me to sharpen my instincts and plot revenge in ways I never imagined. And that night at the dining table, the envelope, the smug look on Victor's face, Melissa's silence. I knew I had already stepped into a war I never asked for. The worst part, I had no idea how deep they had already dug their claws into my life. Victor's shadow began creeping into every corner of my life. After that night at the dining table, he and Melissa started showing up unannounced, carrying bags of groceries or offering to help around the house. It should have been comforting, but their kindness always felt rehearsed, like they were rehearsing lines from a script. I noticed Melissa started asking questions she'd never cared about before. Dad, do you still pay the property taxes manually? What bank did you switch to after Mum passed? Do you have all your medical documents in one place? They weren't questions from a concerned daughter. They were questions from someone cataloguing assets. One evening, while Victor poured himself a glass of my bourbon without asking, Melissa leaned back in her chair and said, Dad, we've been thinking you shouldn't have to worry about all this paperwork. At your age, it's stressful. At my age, like 62 was a death sentence. I smiled politely, but inside my chest rage smoldered. I wasn't weak, not yet, and the condescension in her tone made me feel like a stranger was wearing my daughter's face. The cracks turned into gaping holes. The day I visited my bank in downtown Chicago, I had gone in to deposit a modest pension check, only for the teller to inform me that my account had been flagged for unusual activity. Withdrawals. Big ones. Tens of thousands of dollars. My name was on the paperwork, but I hadn't signed a thing. My hand shook as I reviewed the slips. The ink strokes, almost perfect copies of my own. Almost when I confronted Melissa, she didn't flinch. She said Victor was helping me reorganize. She laughed at my outrage, rolling her eyes like I was a child who didn't understand the modern world. You're overreacting, she said. Victor knows about investments. He's trying to make sure your retirement doesn't vanish. You should be thanking us. But I knew better. I'd seen Victor's grin too smug, too polished. He wasn't saving me. He was positioning himself. And Melissa, she was letting him. No worse, she was leading the charge. That night, I stayed awake staring at the ceiling fan circling shadows above me. Every creak of the house I built with my own hands felt like a betrayal, echoing back at me. I thought about my wife gone too soon, and wondered if she would have seen through Melissa's schemes earlier. I wondered if I had spoiled our daughter with too much forgiveness, too much trust. The next blow came swift and brutal. A letter arrived from Cook County Court, informing me of a petition for guardianship. My heart nearly stopped as I read the words Melissa had filed to have me declared legally incompetent, unfit to manage my own life, finances, or property. It wasn't just betrayal. It was an execution. She was auctioning my life. While I was still breathing, I slammed the letter onto the table, hands trembling. Guardianship would strip me of every decision, every shred of dignity. Victor would control my money. Melissa would control my house. And me, I'd be reduced to a dependent like a child, asking permission to buy my own groceries. I confronted her that night. She didn't deny it. Instead, she leaned forward calm and icy and said, "Dad, you don't get it. This isn't about you anymore. It's about what's smart. You've had your life. It's time to let us handle things before you ruin everything you worked for." My blood went cold before I ruin it. I asked, my voice cracking with disbelief. She crossed her arms, chin tilted high. "You're not thinking straight. Selling the house now while the market's up, investing the money. Victor can turn it into millions. But if you keep clinging to your pride, you'll lose everything. And we won't let that happen." That was the moment the war became official. I walked out into the yard where the maple tree swayed against the night sky. The same tree Melissa once climbed with sticky fingers and scraped knees. I stood there and promised myself I would not let my daughter bury me alive in legal papers. I didn't know how yet, but I would fight back. The courtroom date was set. And as I folded that letter into my jacket pocket, I swore Melissa and Victor would regret ever underestimating me, because they had no idea that the man they thought was old and helpless still had fire in him and the patience to turn their greed into their undoing. Melissa thought she had already won, but she hadn't counted on how dangerous a father becomes when he realizes his own blood has declared war. And that's when I started planning my revenge. Victor thought he'd strip me of surprise, but he hadn't counted on the muscle memory of a lifetime of blue-collar problem-solving. I spent 40 years reading the grain of steel and the hiss of a welding torch. I could read people the same way if I bothered to slow down and listen. After the guardianship petition, I stopped sleeping like a man waiting for a verdict. I started moving like a man setting a trap. My first move was small and stupidly obvious. I began to pay attention to the little things Melissa and Victor left behind, the way a fisherman watches water for the ripple that betrays a fish. Receipts, a wrapper from a deli they liked, the name of a clinic on a business card. When Victor came over to help me organize my paperwork, I kept my hands on the boxes and watched his eyes. He was good at pretending to fumble through files, but his pupils darted to dates, balances the way someone who feeds on numbers hunts scent. I made a list and paper in ink the way my years taught me things. Stick better that way. Bank branch on State Street. A PNC branch he'd been going into twice a week. A locksmith with a 3-week window of maintenance when he had my spare key. The security camera at the corner market across from my house that sometimes caught a clear view of my driveway. I wrote names down and circled them, and then I started knocking on doors. Neighbors in Oak Park. Remember faces more than names. Mrs. Alvarez from next door remembered Melissa as a teenager, making cookies for the blocks, bake sale. She didn't like Victor. Too smooth, she said, in the same voice she used when she warned kids not to cross the street without looking. I asked her about the nights Melissa and Victor were there helping me. She shrugged and said she'd seen Victor's truck more often than she liked. She gave me a little scrap of paper. 2 dates scribbled on one of them. She remembered seeing a young man in a dark hoodie at my mailbox. I took that scrap down to the corner market, where an elderly man named Joe still ran the place Joe had been tending to. People in Oak Park, since before either of my kids were born, he let me look at the time-stamped footage from the market's camera and squinted like the years had taught his eyelids to be useful. Fog-grainy image showed a truck pulling up at 11:14 p.m. The driver's face was turned away, but his hands were steady, as if he'd done the move before. He opened my mailbox, leaned in like a man who knew exactly where to fish for what he wanted, and then shut the box and left later that day. I sat at my kitchen table with a pile of photocopies. Bank slips, a printout of Melissa's marriage license, my own notarized wills from 10 years ago. I had learned one important thing in those long nights. Greed leaves patterns. It was crude and human. The same names, the same addresses, the same excuses recycled, until they sounded like truth. I had a plan that did not involve a lawyer at first. Lawyers are expensive, and money was exactly the weapon Melissa and Victor counted on. They figured I'd be too old or too proud to pay what it takes to fight in court. So I got creative. I went to the Cook County Clerk's office and pulled public records. Mortgage modifications, the deed, transfers near my neighborhood, and suspiciously, a quitclaim that changed hands that had nothing to do with my property, but that led to a P.O. box used by a title company. The two of them frequently mentioned, public records can be painfully dull, but in them I found a strange repeating set of signatures that matched nothing of mine. They matched, however, a notary whose stamp had been misaligned on more than one document. Sloppiness greed makes people sloppy. I started staking out places. I sat in my car outside the PNC branch on State Street, hands on a thermos of coffee that had gone cold by the time I realized I'd been there 3 hours. I watched Victor enter Watch's back as he bent over a teller, his fingers tapping a rhythm that spoke of patience. I followed him discreet, like a man who had learned to move without being noticed, and he led me to a lawyer's office in River North. Not the big glass tower kinds of attorneys who advertise on buses. A small place with a brass plaque, the sort that does elder law and estate planning on the side. There was a man short, hair-thin rim glasses, who came out from a back office and greeted Victor like a client he'd been waiting to add to his ledger. I didn't introduce myself. I took pictures with my phone from across the street, the way people take photos of license plates or suspicious packages. I also wrote everything down in that blue spiral notebook, the one I kept by the bed. Names, times, the make of the car Victor drove. When I walked back to my house under a sky that turned from copper to indigo, I felt like I'd stacked a few more stones in my wall. Not every move had to be dramatic. Some were petty and perfect. I started attending the senior advisory sessions at the Oak Park Library. They had a volunteer program that taught older adults how to spot scams and protect their identity. I listened, nodding, learning the kind of language Melissa and Victor might be using behind my back. I learned about power of attorney paperwork, about how guardianship petitions are framed in terms of best interest and safety. The more I learned, the more I could see the script Melissa had been handed. Terrorize gently, then move in for their safety. There were cracks in their story. The forged bank slips, perfect copies, but for little hesitations in the loop of my signature, came from somewhere. As a kid, I learned to spot mismatched stitches in my father's overalls. This was the same. The loops didn't flow. The way mine did, I took those copies to a friend from the steel mill. Danny, who had since become an office manager at a local printing company. If anyone could tell me whether a document was copied or forged, it would be him. Danny squinted through his glasses, tapped the paper and said, "They tried to match the pressure. Whoever did this knew what your hand looked like, but they didn't know the old way. You press the pen." This was traced or copied, not signed freehand. That was the first real proof that I could hold in my hands. It wasn't enough to win anything in court by itself, but it was a crack in their armor. The next week, I did what I never thought I'd do. I went through the mailbox. At odd hours, I watched, I learned the rhythm of pickups. When the postal truck came and when people slid express envelopes under doors. I paid attention to the P.O. box Melissa used for business paperwork, and I watched a Mana courier in a dark jacket approach it after midnight and slip something inside. I followed him on foot, keeping to the shadowed alleys where my breath came white and the city felt slower. He walked to a rental car with an out-of-state plate, then stashed a small padded envelope beneath the passenger seat before driving off. I reported the rental car to the police anonymously, just to get the plate run. The officer I spoke with, Officer Malik, a patient man with a voice like gravel, took my tip and ran it. The plate returned to a temporary rental, tied to a title company in a neighboring suburb. I told Malik what I was noticing, and perhaps because I'd paid my dues in this city and had been kind to people in small ways for years, he took the lead with a quiet efficiency. I'd grown to trust he couldn't arrest anyone on a hunch, of course, but he came by my house one evening and said, "If you keep noting dates and times and names, come down to the station and sign an affidavit. It helps if things are on the record." That's what I did. I wrote down on paper everything I had observed with the clarity only age and stubbornness can bring. There are advantages to being underestimated. People assume you'll tire out. I used that assumption as a weapon. They thought I'd fold, so they relaxed. I became the man who had time, and with time, I could break their rhythm. Melissa got cocky. She began to gloat through thin smiles at the weekly dinner, where she tried to look like my salvation. "We're just trying to make sure you're comfortable, Dad," she'd say, tucking her hair behind her ear, as if it were an innocent gesture. Behind her, Victor would make a soft, approving sound and hand me a brochure with investment jargon. Inside, numbers shimmered like mirages. I'd thumb through them and see the same pattern. One property that suspiciously had been appraised well above market, and then flipped between shell companies, like a coin. On the morning, I decided to set my trap. The sky was the exact shade of September. You only get in Chicago, sharp clear with the lake smelling faintly of salt and fish. I called my bank politely. with the voice I used to use when I needed favors at the mill and asked to speak with the branch manager. His name was Tom. He sounded surprised to hear from me, but not unkind. I told him simply that I needed my monthly statements mailed and that I wanted any changes to my account held until I could speak to him personally. Tom said he'd flag my account for a review. I'd learned enough to ask for holds for notices for anything that would make it harder for them to move money without fingerprints of their own. Tom agreed to send certified mail when transfers were requested, and to require in-person verification for withdrawals over a certain amount. I felt the net tightening. But you can't win a war with only small victories. That afternoon I followed Victor to a meeting in the Loop, and with the patience of a man who has weathered storms. I recorded nothing but watched everything. Victor met with a man who introduced himself as Mr. Lang, and they spoke about a house in Evanston that had recently gone into probate and suddenly had opportunities. They laughed with the sort of familiarity that made me think of men who had been doing this too long. I wanted to plant a camera and catch every word, but I remembered the laws. Illinois doesn't look kindly on clandestine recordings. So I relied on my eyes and my notes, and the memory that has honed itself into a kind of muscle. That night, in the dim light of my kitchen, I laid out everything I had. Photocopies, printouts, scribbles in the margin of my spiral notebook. The pattern was ugly and sinful. A notary's sloppy stamp and out-of-state rental used to shuttle documents a title company with a P.O. box, and Victor's quiet presence where money wound its way like a parasite. I had enough to take to a lawyer and tug on the loose thread. I had enough to slow them down, but I did not yet have the one thing that would split open the whole scheme. Like a reflection shattered by a thrown stone, undeniable proof that Melissa and Victor had conspired to fabricate my signature to file for guardianship under false pretenses, and to present forged documents to the court. To get that I would need to bait them, and baiting people who think they're untouchable is where husbandry turns into warfare. I had to make them believe the jiggling of the trapdoor was safe, that the mouse could nibble and not notice the noose. I set the bait that very week. And when I did, I discovered two things at once: that greed makes people predictable, and that some people will lay bare their own souls if you give them a whisper of victory. 2 nights later, they gave me an offer I could not refuse, and in their eagerness to finish the job, they left the front door open. The offer came wrapped in charm, as if betrayal needed a bow. Melissa called me on a Sunday afternoon voice, syrupy sweet, the kind she hadn't used since she was a teenager, trying to convince me to extend her curfew. "Dad, we've been talking," she said. "Victor has this amazing opportunity. It's too good to pass up. We want you to be part of it." The air in my kitchen turned heavy. I sat at the table with the phone pressed to my ear, staring at the maple tree outside the window, where sunlight dappled through the leaves. That tree had been a witness to my entire life. Now it was watching me swallow a lime. I played dumb. Oh, what kind of opportunity? Victor's voice cut in. He must have been on speaker. "There's a buyer interested in your property. High cash offer. We're talking well over market value. They want to close fast, and Melissa thought it would be smart if you let us handle the paperwork." "Well, make sure you're comfortable the whole way." Comfortable. That word again. It rolled off his tongue like a salesman pitching a mattress, not a man trying to strip me of everything I'd worked for. I cleared my throat, forcing a tremor into my voice. "I don't know, Vic, the house. It means a lot." Melissa jumped in sharp, but sugar-coated. "Dad is just a house. Don't be stubborn. Imagine the freedom you'll never have to worry about repairs, taxes, or anything. That's when I knew they weren't just testing the waters. They had a buyer, or at least someone they claimed was one. And if I agreed, even halfway, they'd sprint to the courthouse, waving forged papers, claiming I was incompetent, and they had my blessing. So I let the hook sink deeper. Maybe I said slowly, but I'd need to see everything in writing. You know me, I don't sign unless I've read every word. Melissa laughed nervously. Of course, Dad. Well, bring it by this week. You'll see it's a win-win. I hung up my pulse pounding. The trap was ready. They thought they had me nibbling. What they didn't know was that every word would be documented, every move observed. I spent the next day in downtown Chicago at the Daily Center. I walked through the courthouse halls, the marble floors echoing with footsteps, the smell of coffee and paper lingering in the air. I sought out an attorney whose name I'd gotten from one of the library sessions, a woman named Rachel Adler, known for tearing apart shady guardianship petitions. Her office was small, tucked between a bail bond shop and a diner that smelled like bacon grease. She wore her hair in a tight bun, glasses perched low on her nose, and spoke with the clipped efficiency of someone who didn't waste words. Mr. Carver, she said, scanning the file I'd assembled. You've been busy. I slid my notebook across her desk, pages filled with times, dates, and observations. I also gave her the photocopies Danny had examined, with the shaky forgery loops circled in red ink. She adjusted her glasses, tapped the papers, and said, If this is what it looks like, you've got more than just a defense. You've got grounds for fraud, elder exploitation, maybe even conspiracy to commit forgery. But well, need 'em to hand us the smoking gun. I nodded. They're bringing me paperwork this week. I'll let them think I'm falling for it. But I want someone watching someone who can catch them in the act. Rachel's lips curved into a thin smile. I like the way you think. She arranged for a private investigator, a former cop named Jack Delaney, built like a linebacker with eyes that missed nothing. Jack would watch from a distance, documenting everything. What they said, what they presented, how they tried to push me. The night of the meeting, Melissa and Victor arrived with a manila folder tucked under Victor's arm. I kept the living room dim, a single lamp glowing on the side table, so every shadow stretched long and theatrical. Victor laid the folder on the coffee table like it was treasure. Here it is, he said, smiling wide. Simple contracts. You sign, and the money comes through within 2 weeks. Melissa leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at the folder like it already belonged to her. I opened it slowly. My fingers brushed the crisp papers. The first page looked like a standard real estate contract, but the language was tilted, slippery. Words like irrevocable, and the signs whispered red flags. The signature line had my name printed neatly. Waiting for ink, I looked up, heart steady. And if I don't sign, Melissa stiffened. Victor chuckled. Well, then it gets complicated. Courts get involved. But honestly, Mr. Carver, that's not what we want. This way is clean, fast, profitable for everyone. They were pressing me too eager. That eagerness was their weakness. I closed the folder, leaned back, and said softly, I'll think about it. Victor's smile faltered, just for a flicker. Melissa bit her lip, then forced a nod. Okay, Dad, but don't wait too long. Opportunities like this don't last. When they left, I stepped outside onto the porch. Jack Delaney was across the street, leaning casually against his car, pretending to smoke. He gave me a small nod. He'd gotten everything. The following week, Rachel and I sat across from the judge in the guardianship. hearing Melissa and Victor entered the courtroom, dressed like Saints Melissa in a modest navy dress, Victor in a tailored suit. They carried themselves with smug certainty, as if the outcome had already been written. But then Rachel rose, calm, precise. She laid out the evidence. The forged bank slips the notarized documents with misaligned stamps. The photographs of Victor meeting with the shady lawyer, and most importantly, the transcript Jack had prepared from the night they tried to push me into signing away. My home, the courtroom, grew still. Melissa's face drained of color. Victor's jaw tightened his polished exterior. Cracking, Rachel's voice rang clear. Your Honor, this is not guardianship. This it is exploitation. A daughter attempting to auction off her father's life aided by her partner. And here she held up the forged contract the one I'd refused to sign as proof. The judge leaned forward, eyes sharp. Ms. Carver, Mr. Pricado, you have any explanation for this? Melissa stammered. Victor tried to smooth it over with legal jargon, but the damage was done. The proof was undeniable. When the gavel finally came down, the petition was dismissed with prejudice, but it didn't stop there. The judge ordered an investigation into potential fraud and referred the case to the state attorney's office. I sat there, hands steady, as Melissa turned to me with eyes full of venom. She mouthed the word traitor. But I wasn't the traitor. She was. And now the law would strip her down the way she had tried to strip me. Walking out of the courthouse that day, the sun hitting my face, I felt 20 years younger. But deep inside, I knew the war wasn't finished. Melissa and Victor were wounded. Cornered animals now, and cornered animals are dangerous. The question wasn't if they'd strike back. It was when. For a few weeks after the hearing, the silence was worse than the storm. Melissa didn't call. Victor didn't show up in my driveway with his slick suits and fake smiles. It was like they had vanished into smoke. But anyone who's lived long enough knows that silence is just the air, sucking back before the next explosion. I spent those days trying to live normally. Morning walks down Lake Street, coffee at George Diner, fixing the squeaky hinge on the back porch. But every time the phone rang or a car slowed outside my house, I felt my chest tighten. I wasn't naive. I knew Melissa wasn't going to let go that easily. The blow finally came one rainy Friday evening. I'd just settled into my recliner with the Tribune when I heard the knock, not the polite rap of a neighbor, but the heavy, deliberate pounding of law enforcement. 2 officers stood at my door, their raincoats dripping, one holding a folded piece of paper. Mr. Carver, the taller one, asked, "We have a warrant to search your property." I blinked, stunned. For what allegations of financial misconduct? Fraud report came from your daughter, Melissa Carver. My throat went dry. Shed flipped the script she had reported me. I stepped aside as they entered their boots, tracking water across my hardwood floors. They rifled through my desk, my filing cabinet, even the fireproof safe in the garage. Every drawer that clanged shut felt like a slap in the face. I stood there, jaw clenched, while one officer methodically bagged my financial records. By the time they left, the house looked ransacked, hollow. I sat at the dining table, head in my hands, the sound of the rain hammering the roof. Melissa had drawn first blood in the next round. The following Monday, I marched back into Rachel's office, slamming the search warrant onto her desk. "She's turning it on me," I said. My voice was low, simmering. "She's trying to make me look like the crook." Rachel scanned the paper, her brow furrowing. Classic counterattack. They're hoping to muddy the waters, make you look unreliable, maybe even scare you into backing down. Well, I'm not backing down, I growled. Rachel leaned back, steepling her fingers. Good, because I think it's time. We move from defense to offense. You want revenge? We're going to give it to you legally, surgically, and permanently. That was the moment the tide shifted again. No more reacting. It was time to hunt. Step 1, surveillance. Jack Delaney, the private investigator, trailed Victor for 2 weeks straight. He documented late-night meetings at a bar in River North, shady envelopes exchanged in parking garages, phone calls made from burner numbers. He followed Melissa too, photographed her entering a jewelry store, where she spent thousands in cash, despite having no reported income. Step 2, financial tracing. Rachel filed subpoenas for bank records. When the results came back, they revealed a pattern: money funneled from accounts linked to Melissa into shell LLCs registered in Delaware, then siphoned into Victor's brokerage. It wasn't just greed anymore. It was laundering. Step 3, bait. I let slip through a staged phone call. Jack recorded that I had finally decided to liquidate some savings. A large sum, enough to make them salivate. I knew Melissa still had ears in the neighborhood. Word would travel fast. Sure enough, 2 nights later, Victor showed up at my door with Melissa in tow. She wore her practiced concerned daughter face, but her eyes were sharp, hungry. "Dad," she began, "we heard you might be moving some money around. We just want to help you do it safely." Victor nodded, producing another folder. "We can set up a trust, ironclad, untouchable. No one could ever take it from you. I invited them in." My hands didn't shake this time. I offered them bourbon, the same bottle Victor once poured from without asking. He accepted, smug, thinking he had already won. They laid out the trust papers, talking in circles, about protection, about security. But I caught the language immediately. Clauses that transferred power of attorney signatures that would hand control to Melissa and Victor under the guise of safeguarding my assets. I pretended to hesitate, pretended to doubt, then finally said, "All right, leave it with me. I'll sign tomorrow." They left smiling, convinced. What they didn't know was that Jack had filmed the entire interaction from the kitchen doorway, audio and video crystal clear. The next week, Rachel presented the footage to the state attorney's office. The prosecutor's face hardened as he watched Victor pitch his fraudulent trust, Melissa nodding along like a co-conspirator. "This is gold," he said. "Textbook elder exploitation." Well, move fast, and they did. Within days, investigators raided Victor's office, seizing files and computers. Melissa was subpoenaed to testify, her calm exterior cracking as she realized the net had closed. But my revenge wasn't just about legal victories. It was about humiliation. I made sure to attend every hearing, sitting in the front row, as Melissa tried to explain why her bank records showed thousands in unexplained transfers. I watched Victor squirm when the prosecutor presented photos of his late-night meetings. The same courtroom where they tried to strip me of dignity now became their stage of ruin. Reporters even began covering the case. Oak Park woman and partner accused of exploiting. Father. The shame spread like wildfire. Neighbors stopped waving at Melissa. Friends stopped calling Victor's brokerage. Quietly. Dropped him and I. I sat tall, shoulders square, letting the satisfaction wash over me. The day the verdict came down, Melissa wouldn't look at me. She sat pale and trembling as the judge sentenced Victor to federal prison for fraud and money laundering. Melissa herself faced probation restitution and the permanent stain of a felony record. The judge's gavel echoed the chapter closed. I walked out of the courthouse into crisp autumn air, the maple leaves burning red and gold above me. For the first time in months, I breathed easy. Melissa had tried to auction my life, but in the end it was hers that went under the hammer. And the haunting part, I didn't feel joy. I felt nothing. Just the hollow silence of knowing that sometimes the people you love the most are the ones who carve the deepest scars. She thought she could bury me, instead I buried her illusions. And that silence, the one that followed, has stayed with me ever since. After the sentencing, life in Oak Park should have gone back to normal. But normal had been burned out of me, like slag from the furnace. I still woke before dawn, heart racing, expecting a knock at the door or a lawyer's letter slipped under it. Even with Victor behind bars and Melissa shackled by probation and restitution orders, I knew betrayal like theirs didn't just dissolve, it lingered like smoke in the lungs. Neighbors started treating me like a survivor of a fire. Some crossed the street to avoid the awkwardness. Others stopped me at George Diner to whisper, "We read about it." "Jim, we're so sorry." The sympathy was genuine, but it stung. They spoke as though Melissa had died, not walked these same streets, and in a way, maybe she had. One night I found myself standing under the old maple tree, its leaves skeletal in the winter wind. I remembered Melissa as a child, climbing those branches, calling down for me to watch. That girl was gone. The woman who replaced her had sat in court, with dead eyes, signing away her soul for money she never even got to spend. I asked myself 100 times where I had gone wrong. Did I spoil her? Did I fail to teach her what loyalty meant? Or was greed simply a seed that had lain dormant until the right man, Victor, watered it? But some questions rot if you let them fester too long. So I turned to rebuilding my own life. Rachel remained my ally, even after the dust settled. She guided me through securing my assets properly. This time, trust that protected me. Documents notarized by people we could trust, backup, copies stored with the county. For the first time in months, I could look at a piece of paper without fearing it had been poisoned. Jack, the investigator, stopped by once in a while with stories of his police days. He told me Victor had tried to negotiate a lighter sentence by naming other schemes he'd been involved in. And turns out I wasn't his first target, just the one who fought back hard enough to bring him down. That knowledge was a strange kind of comfort. As for Melissa, she tried calling once. The phone rang late at night, her number flashing on the screen like a ghost. I let it ring, let it go to voicemail. Her voice came through cracked. "Small, Dad. Sorry, I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought we could." The message cut off. I never called back because forgiveness is a door you can only open if the foundation of trust is still intact. And she had burned mine to ash. Weeks turned into months. Victor disappeared into prison headlines. Melissa faded from the neighborhood. Gossip moving out of Oak Park entirely. I stayed, that house, that tree, the creaky porch. They were mine, and no one would ever auction them off while I drew breath. People sometimes ask me if revenge was worth it. If the long nights of plotting the legal battles, the humiliation I dragged my own daughter through, if all of that left me hollow, and maybe it did. But hollow is better than buried. Hollow still breathes the final time I saw. Melissa was purely by chance. I was downtown near the Riverwalk, grabbing a hot dog from a stand. She passed by on the opposite side of the street. She saw me, stopped. Our eyes locked across the traffic. She looked older, 10 years older. Though only one had passed, the weight of shame does that to people. She didn't wave, she didn't smile. She just stared as if waiting for something from me, but I gave her nothing. I turned and walked away, mustard still dripping from my hot dog onto the pavement. And that night, alone in my house, I realized revenge isn't fire. It isn't rage. It's colder than that. It's the silence left behind when the storm has passed, and nothing will ever grow the same again. That silence has a voice. It whispers every time I walk past that maple tree. Your daughter once tried to auction your life, and you let her live with the price instead. The end